Hi everybody, Dr. Tracker with you here for lecture 9 of NSCI 306. We're in the home stretch. We have this lecture and then the next one, which will be out later this week. Today I'm going to be talking about summary and synthesis, which are two key skills in your second paper. And then we'll wrap up the series by looking at the ever-present question of so what, how to show significance in your work. So stay tuned for that a little bit later this week. I'm going to switch over to our lecture notes. Today's going to be very practical based on the tasks you have for paper 2 and hope it'll be helpful for you. All right, PowerPoint, come out and play. There you go. We have, of course, our requisite cat meme, because what would a writing class be without cats and memes? I'm going to break this up, do one skill in each lecture. So the first hour we'll be looking at the 4 major things you'll be doing in your paper 2 summaries and give some tips along the way on how to find the information you need and kind of how to approach that. And then part 2 we'll be looking, of course, at synthesis, those 4 steps that I've suggested for approaching that part of the paper. I would guess that the summary is going to take you the most time just because you have to do so much advanced reading. But in some ways, it's the easier task because you have a fairly straightforward rubric for each one of them. You'll be doing some of that work, in fact, in your project proposals, but this is your chance to really dig deep into the scholarship and hopefully to develop some habits that will help you in future research projects as well. So let's get on into that. The first thing you're going to summarize for paper 2 and each of those 5 entries is the main goals of the study. And it helps to pay attention to the verbs here, because in all of the scholarship that I've read, pretty much every single one has something like, this paper aims to do this, or here we explore this particular Dingle-Hopper's effect on Snarf-Blatt culture, or this analyzes this data sets, this considers the effect of, this even tests how this works in this particular context. And it doesn't seem to matter what the field is, you've still got to announce what you're going to do. Now, if there's an abstract, the author is now your best friend. Look very carefully at the abstract and look for those verbs, because that can give you a good starting point for figuring out what the study is trying to do. Depending on the field and sometimes the standards of the journal, you may actually have first person. It does happen occasionally, but you might also see, this study or this paper or this research examines or somehow anthropomorphizes itself into some other function. So be on the lookout for those first. In particular, and this is especially relevant if you're looking at cause and effect, or sorry, if you're looking at scientific studies or studies in social science, the humanities tend to work a little bit differently. Think about cause and effect. So your typical scientific study is researching how one or more variables affect one or more outcomes. And that might be a sociological study like the one we read in from Milgram. How does exposure to this particular treatment condition being told to shock these people affect people's attitudes towards obedience? But more precisely, he looked at what difference does all these other potential variables have on the general outcomes. So we read his MAGE study where he found that 40 out of 56, or 22 out of 40, I think, participants went all the way up to 550 volts and theoretically shocked their fellow human beings, though they didn't actually do that as we discussed in class. But that figure went down when he changed things like the setting of the research, or the attitude, or the appearance, or even the physical proximity of the proxy for the researcher. One of the variants, for example, looked at how if the participant himself actually had to press the button, there were different results than if the researcher pressed the button for the participant. So different variables like that work. And it's not always a strictly speaking causal relationship, because it's really, really hard to prove causation. But what you can do is use correlation. So this happens at the same time as this, to say that this is a more likely outcome, or this can help us predict this. So we see this right now. For example, we know that there is a strong correlation between certain comorbidities, the presence of certain conditions, health conditions or diseases, and COVID-19 infections. There are also correlations between certain age groups and infection rates. And the same thing with looking at infection rates versus death rates. And so we cannot, of course, say something as simplistic as, well, if you're over 65 and you have diabetes, you're definitely going to get COVID-19 and probably die from it. Because that's, well, not accurate for one thing, but that's also not how science works. But what we can say is, if we have 10 people and half of them are over 65 and have diabetes, and half of them are under 65 and don't have diabetes, then the first half is more likely to develop this. And so that's going to drive things like policy decisions. Who stays home from work? Who telecommutes? Which institutions get shut down? Who needs to take extra precautions and stuff like that? So we're doing the same approach here. This is the scientific method. In your summaries, I want you to be very specific about what the authors are trying to accomplish, because you're going to be reading stuff in very similar fields, ideally looking at kind of a cluster of related research questions I talked through when we went over assignment 2. So an example here, you could read a particular study and say, oh, Lee's article is about how students learn English. And in itself, that's not wrong. It's accurate, but it's only accurate to a point, partly because a lot of other studies, probably including all of the other ones you're looking at, are about how students learn English if you're in that particular research field. And so you want to see, how does this treat the specific variables involved? So in this case, Lee analyzes how ESL students' anxiety levels, gets to that specific variable, the potential cause and affect how well they learn English. And this is a correlation study, as well as most of the research you'll get to. If the author has done a good job on the paper, this goal will be set out very clearly, either in the abstract or the introduction, or sometimes both. Sometimes though, you've got to do a little bit of digging to figure out what they're actually trying to do. And there's going to be some technical language. So you have to figure out what they're actually talking about in those terms. This is one reason why I had you guys read and do the response paper on the Wakefield study. I know it's a very hard read, but it got you used to wading through the technical jargon to figure out what exactly these researchers are trying to accomplish. So you're going to do the same thing in the first part of your summaries here. I've also asked you to look at the research questions. Now, this is a structural element you see in a lot of different studies, but it might not always look the same way in every study. In some cases, you might have a set, even a section called research questions. You see that? Very easy for you. And they might be all grouped together like that. Sometimes, though, there will be spaced apart. So there might be, as part of the literature review, a section on, so here's one thing we want to look at, and here's what other people have done, and why this is important, all this stuff, the kind of work you'll be doing in this same paper. And then at the end, it'll say, accordingly, here's one of the research questions we're looking at. Another way you see that is with research hypotheses. Obviously, those work better for certain kinds of research. In my own dissertation on American literature, hypotheses aren't really helpful, because I'm not trying to test them in the same way that I could in a chemistry paper or in a biology paper or in a sociology paper. And so you're going to see different formats of these, but basically these are ways to organize the whole approach to the topic. And I talked more about that in a previous lecture as well. As a reminder, most of these should be open-ended, and they generally start with how or why, because you want to know, how does this work? What is going on here? They may be something like, what are the specific effects of X on Y? Or how do these two things interact to potentially cause this? Or what can we learn about this particular element of this thing? So I encourage you to look carefully over the sample proposals and the sample papers to see how those set up and how the authors pulled them out. The whole paper addresses those questions. So if they're listed up front, keep them in mind as you read the whole thing, especially the results and discussion sections, and I'll get to those a little bit later. In your summary, you're probably not going to have room to copy and paste all of the research questions because sometimes there's a long list of them. But their function is to help you understand and later describe what the study is trying to do and kind of how it approaches that. So if you know, going back to our earlier example, that the research question is about what are the particular effects of anxiety in this student population, then it will help you say, okay, so I see why you have this survey question, or I see why you are testing these results, or I see why you have this in the interview, or whatever it is. So it's there to help you as a reader follow what they're trying to do. I've also asked you to summarize parts of how they gather and analyze their data. And this can be a little bit of an intimidating part because there's going to be a lot of new material. Even if you're in the major, you've had some chance to take some major classes, a lot of the methods are going to be new to you. And there's going to be a lot of technical jargon and technical vocabulary here. So you want to take your time here and figure out what's actually happening. And again, the authors can make your job a little bit easier here if they describe their work well. So here's some things to look for. As you are trying to understand data collection, remember that kind of helps to work backwards. So when you're planning a study, and those of you who have done primary research have experienced this firsthand, you need to ask several questions about how data works here. It's not as simple as, look, there are numbers, let's do something interesting with them. So first thing you want to figure out is what data do they actually get? So is this a series, is this just a numerical ranking, or you've probably gotten the endless series of the quick 2-minute surveys from every store you've ever shopped at. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your experience? Back when eBay used to be, an actual thing instead of a, you mean Amazon doesn't have it? Okay, I guess I'll go to eBay. Feedback would be everything for buyers and sellers. They really push to get all that positive feedback. So there are different kinds of data you can draw on here. You want to figure out who is providing that data. Are they talking to specific individuals? Are they talking to groups? What characteristics do those groups have? What demographics are involved? Why are they interested in this particular population? Are they trying to be representative of maybe a larger population? So if I want to say, I want to find out what Cal State students do, how they think, and I said, well, I'm only going to talk to the African-American males in the Cal State population. Well, I get data, but someone could legitimately say that may not represent the perspective, the priorities, or the information of every Cal State student. And so I'd have to think about how representative is this sample. On the other hand, I might set up a research project. Like, I want to know, what is the experience of non-Hispanic racial minority students in a Hispanic serving institution like Cal State, in which case it would be perfectly appropriate for me to talk to African-American students, primarily or even potentially exclusively. So they're picking the population or the sample. You'll see those terms a lot in the studies you read. And then, of course, there are methods. I'll talk about those a little bit as well. So how and when do we get this data? There are 20,000 Cal State students. I do not have time to sit around, to walk around and talk to each one of them. Even if I could manage to get them all in the same place at roughly the same time, even if I had the energy to handle all those interviews, it's just not practical. And so to gather data, you have to make decisions about how that's going to work, where your methods for gathering that. What's the timing going to be? Do you want to do this all in one day? Do you want to spread this out? Do you want to observe people over the course of a year? Do you want to do like a census kind of model where you come back every few years and say what's changed here? And the last big question is, how do we make sure this is actually useful for our research questions? Because if you don't know what sort of data you need, it's going to be that much harder to collect it effectively. Because I could go out, again, and theoretically start kind of random conversations, but unless I ask even the same set of questions or the same set of conditions, I'm not going to get uniform data in kind of a useful way. And so this is a fairly complicated process, but I think it helps to keep these complications in mind as you decide how you're going to summarize what other people have done. Now, in scholarly work, often you will get surveys or interview data. If you're dealing with human beings, that's a good way to gather opinions or beliefs or thoughts or experiences. So you guys are filling out SOTIs. They just released them and sent my email. And SOTIs are our course evaluations. And so that is a form of survey data. But they choose, they being some mysterious committee somewhere in the bowels of the Cal State administration, they choose what questions to put there. They decide, how do we deliver these? Think back, way back into before times when we actually met in classrooms. We have all these instructions for exactly how you're supposed to fill them out and who can be in the room and who can't be in the room and what you're supposed to do with them afterwards. At one of my previous universities, there was a rule for a while that you could only fill out the course evaluations in pencil. And every single term, I would have to carry with me like a bundle of 30 pencils because none of my students carried pencils. Why would they? We have phones and laptops and computers and ballpoint pens, which are way better anyway. So all of that is going to affect the kind of information you get. This is called instruments, not like gonna play the, I don't know what instrument that is, like the trumpet, but I missed or something. But in the sense of here's how we are going to get that information. So there are many kinds of surveys. Some of them are standardized to collect certain types of data. Some of them are targeting particular populations or particular settings. For your summaries, then, tell me what tools the researchers use to get their data. If you have room, you could include a sample survey question if you have that sort of information available. But do keep it on your word count because it's easy to go over that. And I have in the paper 2 lecture notes some suggested word counts for each of those sections. You also want to tell me how many people actually participated in this. And watch the numbers carefully here because they may throw several different kinds of numbers at you. Let's say I'm doing an email survey of every student, not just in the CSUSB population, but the entire Cal State system. I don't know, that's a lot of people. And the chances are effectively zero that every single one of those students will reply and fill out my survey and give me all the useful comments and everything there. Even when I do a paper survey, the SOTIs, I can't guarantee that every single student is going to be there or that the students who are there that day are even going to turn something in because they have sometimes just turned in the blank form and left class because they have better things to do that day. So you want to watch out for who is excluded from the analysis and look for the final number. It might be called participants or respondents. We know, for instance, in Wakefield study, there were 11 or 12, I forget now exactly, a small number of children in the group. I think there were 12, 8 out of 12, right? And that is going to make a big difference, as you pointed out in your response papers, on the kind of data he gets and the potential usefulness of that analysis. So that takes us to the actual analytical part of the paper, and particularly in science papers, this is going to be a large portion. Again, kind of a hard slog to get through. Let me give you some terminology then. So in general, there are three main methods for data analysis. There are kind of main models of doing this. Quantitative focuses on numbers, so think quantity here. Qualitative focuses, broadly speaking, on experience, so it's more about individuals. And then you have mixed methods where you combine quantitative and qualitative. And the specific choices that the researchers make will include what sort of methods do I want to use here, and why is that potentially useful or important or appropriate for the work that I'm doing. A SOTI is a mixed method in the sense that you give comments about particular aspects of your experience in the course, but you also give numbers. And that's because we use the data in different ways. When I get the SOTI results, which of course come next quarter, I would expect to get them until well, maybe even after the summer quarter is over. I get a PDF scan of the actual written comments, and then I get a numerical summary of the fill in the bubble kind of things. So that means I can look and kind of have a glimpse, as can my supervisors, of course, at the university, and say, overall, where did I score on these different questions for the quantitative questions? But then I can read through and say, all right, what are the students actually saying about this? And sometimes that's a lot more useful data for me, because if I get through the SOTIs and the numbers, the overall numbers I'm satisfied with, they reflect that I'm doing a good job as a teacher, but 5 or 6 or 7 out of every class of 20 some, 21, 23, however many we have in here, say, I really hated response paper number 2. We should just never do that again. Wakefield, die, die, die. I've never actually gotten that particular comment, but I've got some interesting ones. That gives me useful information. And so I might think next time I teach the course, maybe we won't do that particular reading, or maybe we will approach a different way or use a different standard for that particular paper. So there I have primarily qualitative data that I'm using to make a change, but also keep in mind the quantitative data, because if only one student out of 23 said, oh, I hate paper 2 so much, then maybe I'm not going to take that. That's not going to weigh as heavily on my decisions, because I think, 22 out of 23, I'll just keep that going. In your summaries, then you want to look specifically at how they analyze. So not just the overall methods, the overall design, maybe is a better term, but the analytical methods. Again, you don't have to reproduce every single one of these in your summary, because sometimes they do a lot. Think about the Wakefield study. Sorry, flashbacks, but think about the Wakefield study. They ran 8 or 10 gastrointestinal clinical tests on each of the children, and also 8 or 10 neuropsychological tests, and talked about the behavior and looked at the family history and took medical histories and talked to the parents and all this stuff. And so they could analyze each of those differently, but also say, here's a statistically significant difference in population A versus population B. And so you're going to see a lot of theories thrown around here. You see a lot of statistical terms. If you have taken stats, that will help a lot. Honestly, that's the one class that I really wish now I had taken in college that I didn't, because I run into so many stats in my editing, and I've kind of had to pick that up sort of piecemeal as I go, because I never actually took the class. So it's a very useful class, believe it or not, especially if you end up being a copy editor. The other thing to keep in mind here is that one of the ways to show novelty, something that's new in your work, is to change the methods. So maybe we have 50 studies quantitatively, that is with numbers, measuring the graduation rates of this particular population of college students. Great. But what you really want to know is what motivates those students. And you could potentially design a quantitative survey and say, all right, please check the box that most closely describes your motivation for graduation. Or would you say you strongly agree that you're graduating because your parents want you to, or you moderately agree? And that could be useful data. But you might decide, I really need to change the script a little bit. Instead of looking just at the numbers, I want to interview these graduates. And I want to say, okay, tell me about this process for you. What happened as you were deciding, hey, I really need to graduate from college here? And so that could be part of the contributions they're making, which is, of course, another part of your summary. So pay attention to those. One last tip on the data analysis before we move on. Don't try to list every single method or every single statistical test. Especially in the quant studies, there are too many. And you will wrap yourself up in knots trying to understand them and figure out how they all apply exactly. So you can use phrases like a series of these tests showed this. The main thing is to get to the results there. Speaking of which, the results section is sort of the payoff. This is where they've done the work, they've set up the right kind of data for their questions, they have looked at how have other people approached this, and they have said, okay, here's what we can actually find. Here's all the data we collected, here's the stuff, and here's how we're going to present that. That means these tend to be long, because especially if you gathered multiple kinds of data from in multiple situations, you've got to report on all of that. You can't just pick the 2 or 3 things that you think were most interesting or made the prettiest graphs. So give yourself time to read through these sections. There is going to be a lot of repetition in a section like this, particularly since scholars tend to investigate very similar research questions for the same sample. And so they might go through 3 pages just on, all right, let's look at the particular effects of race or ethnicity on this outcome variable. And they go through all the analysis. They say this showed this and this showed this, and overall this suggests X and Y and Z. And then they go back to square one and say, okay, now let's look at the specific effects of income or class on the outcome variable. And they do the same thing over and over and over. Charts and graphs can help there to take some of the burden off of just throwing all the numbers at you. But they're mostly there to see patterns or trends in the data. So if you see that 75% of your study sample exhibited the same set of symptoms, which is what Wakefield allegedly found, then that could be a significant thing to highlight. That's a useful thing to put in the charts. One approach you might take here, see, overall I want you to focus on kind of the big picture findings. What did they learn about this topic? What did they discover about how these particular molecules interact, or what the prevalence of this biomarker on this gene can tell us about predicting this particular kind of cancer, or how does this drug improve survivability or reduce side effects or turn hair green, or whatever it's supposed to or maybe not supposed to do. And that's going to be in some ways like the abstract and kind of the overall summary. But this is also a good time to kind of zoom in on something that you think is significant, particularly if this helps you generate ideas for a new project. And I'm going to come back to that question in the synthesis section later on. But I want you to keep it in mind, not just as you are synthesizing, but also as you are summarizing. What can you learn about what's been done that might give you a hint about what could be done in future work? In the results section, they'll also often revisit their hypotheses. So if they say we want to test these 5 things, it's very common to just march through each one of those. So hypothesis 1A suggested that if you turn the light on, the room gets brighter. Survey says false. Okay, it doesn't actually work like that, but I had to bring in that line somewhere. So the results section will often be tied to those. And so if you had brought up those research questions or those hypotheses in your summary, you could say in terms of this prediction, they found that it actually doesn't work because of this. And often what you'll see is they will say, here's what was confirmed, here's what we actually learned from the testing. This is as expected, or this is surprising, or here's what might account for this, especially in the discussion section, you'll see that. So if 5 out of 6 results were the same kind of relationship they expected or the same thing they predicted, and number 6 was just way out there, then a good question to ask is, what happened to number 6? Why is this group acting this way, or why did this reaction happen this way, or what was the difference in this particular thing? And that can actually be a really important part of your work, because maybe 5 out of 6 treatments did not even touch the cancer cells, but the 6th one said, hey, get out of their cells, go, or disintegrated them, or transmogrified them, or did something that is clinically useful. Then you really want to know what happened in number 6. And so that might be a place to look at in the results. And then you're going to summarize the contributions of the article. And again, a good author will do some of this work for you. Every single academic author to publish has to find some way to say this is important. This work makes particular contributions. And so they tend to say that up front. In fact, I do a lot of editing projects where I will leave comments, especially in the intro, and say, okay, I can see what you're doing here. Tell me why. Why is this particularly important to understand? What's different about this setting or this text or this idea that's going to help people in your field understand this thing better? And so they'll often tell you what that is. Look in the abstract or introduction for that. And particularly at the end of the article, sometimes in a separate section called contributions or implications, they will show you how that works out and why that's important. So the abstract might have something like, this has important implications for classroom teaching. It's like, okay, what exactly? And then you have to read the rest of the article to find out, because the abstract's the trailer, the teaser. So our basic question, the so what, right? What can we do or understand now that we couldn't do or understand before? What do we know now about the behavior of this particle, of this cell, of this moving part in the electrical apparatus that we built in the lab? What do we know more about how this character works, or how these authors interacted with this part of their culture? What do we know now about how this particular musical performance was important? What do we know now about how this disease attacks these particular cells and how we can potentially stop it? There's got to be a so what on the other end, or you haven't really done, well, science, but arguably argument at all. So I encourage you, as you are thinking through this part of your summary, you might have to play let's pretend. So I hope that all of the articles that you read for this paper will be helpful for you personally. They will contribute somehow to what you know about this topic, or they maybe help you clarify something about what you could do, or at least help you follow something in future classes or future readings. That's sort of a side benefit. But I want you to say, let's pretend that you're already an expert in this field. Why would you care about this particular article? How is this going to be important to those people, to those scholars, and to those future researchers? Because that may or may not be you. The vast majority of the work that I edit is way outside of my academic expertise, which is primarily in American literature. But one of my jobs as an editor is to act on behalf of the reader and to say, okay, who might care about this? What sort of contributions could this study make? And sometimes to nudge my authors and say, yeah, I see that this is potentially interesting, but why? And that's generally not going to be, hey, I personally think this is really cool, because I generally don't. I generally would not read the papers unless they were paying me to read them and improve them. But I can see, here's why this might matter for other experts here. Here's what they could potentially do with information like that. So you want to think in those terms, both here as you're understanding someone's contributions, and later as you're explaining what your contributions are. That gets into the synthesis, which we'll get to next. The last thing I want to touch on this part is summarizing the personal significance. And I have asked you for each of your summaries to identify something specific that interests you about that study, so the article you just read. And the best versus the other ones that they get the full credit, connect in some way to the work that study has done. So as you are finding things to highlight there, do kind of think of like a highlight reel. If you were doing a highlight reel for a baseball game, you're probably not going to spend all the tape on that one routine ground ball, goes right between second and third base, and the shortstop or the second baseman, depending on who's playing there, scoops it up, throws to first, easy out. Now, there's lots of skill involved there. That could maybe be an important part of the game. But it's not nearly as exciting as showing the big home run or the dramatic catch or the curveball that strikes him out in the bottom of the ninth with bases loaded. In the same way, you want to highlight the materials here that show something about the work that this study has kind of uniquely contributed. So some things you might consider here. You could highlight a particular research finding, and that might be in this population, this trend was observed to cause this or to result in this or to improve this or whatever. Maybe it's a method that is new to you, so that you hadn't thought about looking at it before. Maybe it's an entire theoretical framework. I got a lot of mileage out of this when I was doing my literature review for my dissertation, because I had sort of a sense of how I wanted to approach these novels, but I didn't really have a lot of vocabulary yet to say, here's how I see this kind of in overall bird's eye view terms. And so I would draw on some of the models and some of the frameworks that my colleagues who published before had done. That one was I want to look at these a set of religious novels in terms of purity and presence, and she went on to explain what that meant in her data and the novels she looked at. And so I thought, that's actually really cool. I want to see if I can adapt that and show, with credit of course, how that might work in my data, how that might be important there. So you can think both about the specific things they found, as well as kind of how they approach the topic. You might also think about relationships that they show that maybe were a surprise to you, things that you hadn't thought that those would be important. Because in any given relationship between a potential cause and an effect, an outcome, there's something to say, okay, yeah, that's going to be obviously important. In deciding what kind of car to buy, pretty much everyone is thinking about money at some point, about cost. But maybe you do a study and you find that actually the color of the car makes a lot bigger difference than we first would suspect. Or maybe the weather outside when you're car shopping is going to help, or the way in which there are certain interactions with sales critters. I know last time when I was shopping for my current car, I ran into some odd sales critters, and sometimes they were very knowledgeable. The cars were good quality, but it's like, this is just a weird experience. And then there were some dealerships where it was treated really well. They knew a lot about their products, and they answered all my questions, and they showed me what they had. And it was just not a good fit for either my budget or the kind of car I was looking for or something like that. And so as we're trying to isolate that data, whether that's in a marketing context or something completely different, sometimes you got to think creatively about what might affect those particular things. And again, it's a really good exercise for you because that's what you're doing to determine the kind of work you might want to do, the kind of contribution you might want to make in your own study. So if they might get you thinking and say, I wouldn't have initially predicted that the paint job would make that big a difference. But now that I know that, I wonder if this other related variable could be important. As you are presenting these, please be professional and academic in how you express that interest. So don't just say, oh, it is totally cool that this thing exists. It may well be totally cool, but you're also totally in college. So give me specifics about how the study has educated you, how it's influenced your own thinking, how it has somehow enriched your understanding of this topic. And that's a little harder than it looks. So do pay attention to those things that you notice. Say, oh, okay, I see that's an interesting part. But then also think, how can I express that in terms of why that's significant? And you got some practice of that in analyzing quotes already. You pulled out a quote in paper one, said, all right, here's something that the journalist said. And then your job is to say, so what? Why is this important to the argument that I'm making? You can do the same thing here. We're going to take a break here with our second cat meeting of the day. And in part two, I'm going to come back and we're going to look at synthesizing research. And I'll finish up by showing you some ideas for forming your own potential topics, because that will be one of the more difficult parts of that paper. Even if you don't quite get to that point in the rough draft, you will want to have that there as well. So I'll see you back here for part two.